Uncovering COVID-19 Pandemic, a Channel 5 special, is brought to you by the Belize Bank Limited, Holy Redeemer Credit Union, and Citrus Products of Belize Limited.
Good evening and welcome to Uncovering COVID-19 at Channel 5 Special. I'm your host, William Neal, and we're deviating a little bit from our regular way that the show runs. We don't have a panel tonight. We have a single guest, which means that you just have to work overtime and do a lot of work tonight. Our guest tonight is Lord Michael Ashcroft. Good night and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed, Will. Great to be here.
Now, you've been in Belize for the entire COVID pandemic. How has that impacted your perception of the country?
Well, this is my fourth month that I've been here. It was never the intention that I would spend so long, but I happened to be in the right place at the right time when the pandemic hit. And having to deal with many things around the world, I was able to be in one place, and with such things as Zoom and Microsoft and all the rest of it, I've been able to keep in touch and deal with everything. And at the same time, I wanted to reacquaint myself with every district of Belize. So I've been right the way down to the south, to places like Dolores and Barranco and San Vicente, in the west as far as Arenal, and up to the north towards the border, Mountain Pine Ridge. And part of it was to get into conversation everywhere with people. It's down in Toledo, just parking the car up, walking into the villages, people seeing this stranger, curiosity, engage in conversation, and quite often have a crowd to be able to chat to, find out what are the issues that affect them, how they live their lives, and throughout the whole of the country. So it's been my one-man focus group of people's attitudes, what's important to them, and also to chat politics with them and ask some questions often, like, when did you last either see the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition? How often do you see your representative? And it seems to be coincidental that it's all about the same time when there's elections that I've found. But that's been fantastic, and the differences between the north and the south of the country has been quite incredible. And for the rest of the country, Belize City is like a slightly different planet, very different to the rest of the country.
What was the reception like in general from people?
Very friendly. The number of people who, many of them recognized me facially and would call my name out, and I would engage them in conversation. Others, as I was engaging them in conversation and then introduced myself, had the recognition of the name. And to some of them I would cheekily ask, and what have you heard about me? To sort of gauge, what that type of reaction was. And I thoroughly enjoyed it and went out nearly every day for a number of weeks to different parts of the country, whether it was the Mennonite community, and I visited them in Spanish Lookout, in Shipyard, in Blue Creek, engaging then this group of people in conversation. It was and the Garifuna in Dangriga, chatting to the fishermen down there about their catches and their life and their day and the price of lobsters, and asking them, were they naughty boys before June the 15th and out catching? No. So it was very good. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and so the pandemic to me has given me that extra bonus.
Now, the last time you were here at the station, actually, there was a protest organized just for you. You didn't have no such luck anywhere else in the country?
No, nothing at all.
Is that something that impacts the way you maneuver the entire country? Is that a part of any trepidation at all?
No, I've had no, I've had no trepidation around the country. And do bear in mind that this demonstration outside Channel 5 isn't the first time. A few years ago, we had the great organisation called COLA, where it was Coalition for Opposition Against Lord Ashcroft, and we had them marching in the streets around the Belize Bank. I can't even remember what the reason was at the time. And so I've had that. But the Channel 5 one was a fascinating one, because a few days later, I was in my regular coffee house, which is with Jeremy Spooner in Spooners, and Jeremy came up to me and he said, the president of FECAB, David Almeidas, would like to meet you. So I stood there, and Jeremy said, can I give any message back to David? And I said, no, just say that you've conveyed the message. So after that, I gave a call to someone that I knew would have his cell phone, got the number, rang him up, and said, David, Michael Ashcroft here. I gather from Jeremy that you'd like to have a chat. I'll be in the Radisson today. And we sat down for 2.5 hours, and we chatted. There was no hostility. David made his points of his members as to how they felt, gave me a rundown on the political scene of Belize as he saw it, which to me was very useful. You learn something from anybody if you're prepared to sit down and listen to them. And I said to him is that answer me the questions of why are the tour guides and the tour operators very concerned about a port project, because aren't we on the same side? Don't we all want the visitors here to say Belize is a great place? Don't we want a berthing facility here which people can spend an extra couple of hours and the crew can come ashore and we work together? I said, because the elephant in the room is not anyone local. The elephant in the room are the cruise liners. And I said to him, as I've said to others, that in one Caribbean country, the government decided they wanted to double the passenger tax from the cruise liners. So the cruise liners effectively said, well, that's fine, it's your prerogative. We'll just gently ease you out of our program. So I said, you've got to bear in mind is that you've got to keep the cruise liners happy through all this. So it's no good always, we demand this, we demand that. Because on the other hand, you don't particularly want the cruise liners to think there's always trouble when you come to one particular port. And Belize mustn't miss the opportunity to have a berthing facility, because in a few years' time, with bigger cruise liners, they will go to the ports where there are berthing facilities, and those that don't have them could well lose out. So it's an interesting dynamic. And so I think Belize just needs to make up its mind as to what it wants and just get on with it before it's too late, because it has really gone on for too long now.
Now, I just want to go back a little bit to the tour and meeting people. Obviously, by meeting David, you don't shy away necessarily from people, even if it's not an easy meeting, so to speak.
Well, you might be surprised, Will. A couple of years ago, I even got the cell phone of Moise Hyde and gave him a call and suggested that we had a cup of coffee. I think it must have taken days to get over the shock, but the answer was no, he wouldn't meet me. But I was quite happy to have a one-on-one with Moise, and I'm quite happy to have a one-on-one now, if he'd like to meet me.
In those kinds of conversations, people have an impression of you. How do you address that perception? Because I think for many people, going into a meeting, they may then decide that this is a particular agenda that you may be driving that they don't agree with. So how do you have a conversation around a difficult area, perhaps one of disagreement?
Well, what I found in life is the people that dislike me the most are those that have never met me. So a perception develops that somebody who is wealthy, who has at one time employed 100,000 people around the world, must have a certain caricature. But I too have come from humble beginnings. I wasn't born with a spoon in my mouth. My father left school at 14, enlisted at World War II as an infantryman. He managed to get commissioned during World War II because of his leadership qualities and exited an officer, which was quite unusual. And my mother was a nurse. And they weren't wealthy, and to their dying day they weren't wealthy. And so my upbringing in the north of England was in what they call a 2-up, 2-down house with a toilet in the backyard, where torn up newspapers were my toilet paper. So it's not difficult for me to sit down and empathize with anyone. And when I first started working, I had no home. I traveled around in my car with a collapsible bed in the trunk of the car. And I would say, and they'd say to people, you know, can I stay for a couple of days? Well, I'm sorry, we haven't got a room, but I've got my own bed. I've worked as a swimming pool attendant. I've worked as a post office delivery guy. I've worked as a barman. The one thing I haven't worked at is a gigolo, but maybe that will come. But those are the things that I did, and I've never lost that through the years.
Now, one thing that I found interesting was you took a bus after your car broke down. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I was sort of halfway back from one of my trips to Orange Walk. I'd walked around Orange Walk and Shipyard and Blue Creek and that area, and all of a sudden the car conks out. So we get the car off the road as the first thing, before getting on the telephone and calling for help. And then as I was standing on the road, the bus appeared round the corner. So like a good hitchhiker, I stuck my thumb out, and I wasn't really expecting the bus to stop. And the guy did, and I got on the bus, and I could immediately see a few people recognize me. So it was already a comical situation. And then somebody said, this is $2. And I said, $2? Really? $2? That's a lot of money. But anyway, there was humor in it too. And I spoke to a couple of the people there, and then came down to the terminal, and then walked back towards the Radisson from the terminal. But I have no problem or issue with that.
What would you have as the main takeaway from your tour of Belize?
It's a wonderful country. And if only it had wonderful leaders, this would be one hell of a country.
Now, that I will leave that for a little bit later in our conversation. Are you planning, after the engagement with people, any kind of philanthropic kind of work based on what you've seen across the country?
Well, I'd like to think so. I'm 74, so another 5 years, 79. During that period of time, in an ideal world, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to enhance the philanthropic side. It's public knowledge back in the UK that nearly 90% of my wealth goes into a charitable foundation when I depart upstairs. So I'd like to start to be able to do a number of different types of projects. Where they are, I would hope that whoever wins the next election, that I'd be able to go and offer, first of all, a deal on all the outstanding litigation and compromise it one way or the other, and say, after 12 years of fighting, let's put that to one side. And let's try and work together, especially after the pandemic, when the country is down on its knees. I would like to be able to work somehow in order to assist the country as my own business interests wind down. because I'm not as active in the commercial world or business world as I once was. I'm enjoying the fruits of my labor over the years. But it will depend on the attitude of the next government.
Now, COVID itself, we're at a crossroad of sorts where we're talking about opening the borders and how important that is as we try to talk about, our health and medical and economical health. How do you see that balancing itself out?
Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, I said to the Prime Minister, I don't envy your decision-making here, because you will only know in hindsight whether you got it right or wrong, not foresight, because even the science is unpredictable. And as it has turned out, all the modeling that these scientists have done, you might as well have had a crystal ball in front of you and just come out with any answer, because they've all proven to be wrong and not sustainable. And there is no roadmap on something like this. And so I said that I don't envy any leader of a country in having to make the decisions. Now, clearly the first thing that any leader does is seek medical advice for the medical health of the country. But medical health takes no account of economic health. And on any medical health, there is always a residual risk and the more you try to eliminate the residual risk, the further the economy goes down and people suffer unemployment, other people are not getting the medical help. There's a whole stack of other things that build up. Companies go bust. And it's the politician who has to make that critical decision as to when the economic health of the nation outweighs the medical health. You will always get people who will say, we must keep our borders closed until it's eradicated. But this virus will be around for the next couple of years in one form or the other. No small nation, not even a big nation, will survive by shutting itself down for that period of time. And on the other hand, always remember that we do learn as a pandemic goes through. It's less than 0.5% of the population who are likely to die. So therefore 100% of the population is paying the price for the 0.5%. Now, I'm in that 0.5%. I'm 74, so I've got age against me. I'm a type 2 diabetic, that's against me. Slightly overweight, as you've observed, Will. And also recently had sepsis. But I don't expect any nation to shut itself down to protect me. I have to accept the condition that I'm in and do the best I can and take as many precautions as I can and take my responsibility myself. And so in some of these countries, the focus should be on how do we, as we open our borders, how do we protect the vulnerable? And what do we need to do there? So these are very difficult decisions. And I'm sure the Prime Minister is wrestling with it on one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand. But the majority of companies are opening up their borders. Even the Western nations or European nations, some of the Caribbean countries are already. So the one thing that Belize has to its advantage right now is it can see what is happening in other smaller nations as they open their borders. But there has to be a time in which even those that scream and shout that you're cold and heartless in opening your borders, you've got to make that hard choice. And I think where Belize is concerned is that if you balance that economic health, and as I've traveled the country, it's not just the people I've been talking to. I've been talking to owners of lodges and guest houses. I've visited just about every quay that has infrastructure on it, is that we're going to have to do the best we can with the protocol we can as soon as we can and balance that equation. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is wrestling with at the moment. And I would, at a guess, go along with the current consensus that we should be opening up no later than the beginning of August. And let's hope we have enough swabs and test kits and the ability to track and trace, and let's get this economy back up, because this is a big, big hit to the nation. And before we run out of our foreign currency reserves and we build up an enormous amount of unsustainable debt once again.
On that note, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about your book and more a global perspective before we zero in on the problems or challenges that Belize faces. Don't go anywhere. Uncovering COVID-19, a Channel 5 special, continues after these messages.
Save, save, save. The credit union way.
Member owners are encouraged to save regularly, borrow wisely, and repay promptly.
No use keeping the money in your pocket. Soon as you turn wrong, you know you ain't got it. So as money goes from hand to hand, give your cash to the umbrella man. I'm telling you. Save, save, save. The credit union way. Save, save, save. It will make you rich someday.
So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice, 100% Belizean, 100% pure and natural. Yeah, for the young and the old, for the rich and the poor, we drinking Caribbean pride. Yeah, for the hot and the cold, so me want a little more, and me not tell no lie. So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice. Well, alright, tell them we drinking Caribbean pride. Orange juice, or get the grapefruit. Sweet and unsweet, and you can choose. Get the apple, the pineapple, the fruit punch. Just pop the bottle. Yeah, quality in every sip. Me tell you how me taste the pride in every drip. Yeah, Caribbean pride #1. Tell them we drinking Caribbean pride.
In these challenging times, the one thing that is certain is that the Belize Bank Limited is here for you. There is nothing more important than your health and safety, and we continue to make every effort to make banking safer for you. Our staff is working around the clock to make sure you can do your banking conveniently 24/7 using our mobile banking app and online banking, and keeping ATMs up and running. We value your relationship with us and are here to provide the support you need. First responders are also out there 24/7. Thank you, healthcare workers, security forces, firefighters, caregivers. You are all appreciated. Stay safe. We will get through this together. The Belize Bank, our country, your bank.
Welcome back to Uncovering COVID-19, a Channel 5 special. We have a special guest in the house, Lord Michael Ashcroft. And before the break, we were talking a little bit about Belize in terms of the tour. But I noticed on your Twitter feed that you also comment vigorously on global issues. One of those issues has been the riots in the US and Black Lives Matter. I noticed that you chose something from Muhammad Ali to put up. Why comment on issues on a global scale for you?
Well, having having been in politics in the United Kingdom, in the House of Lords for the period of time that I have, and also being on the main board of the UK Conservative Party, politics and world affairs have been in my blood. And I've travelled, luckily I've been able to travel to just about 146 countries. I'm also the honorary chairman of an organisation called the International Democrat Union, which is a worldwide group of right-of-centre political parties. I'm a conservative. And so I've met many of the world leaders and other politicians around the world, and many of them are my friends. And so I have a great interest in what's happening, and I'm a news junkie. There's hardly a day goes past. I even, whether it's British news, I'm watching British Sky News one moment, I'm switching to either CNN, anti-Trump channel, or I'm moving to Fox News, pro-Trump channel, reading all the newspapers on my laptop. So it's of great fascination to me.
When you see something of that nature, and people have been talking about, you know, a 30-year span in between the riots and nothing changing, as someone who has had life experience and political experience, what are your views on something of that nature, even though it's not necessarily in your home country?
Well, I watched the US ones with fascination. As a Democrat, peaceful protesting is acceptable in any democracy. But when it turns to looting and violence, I think we enter an area, a very difficult area. And that in itself becomes very divisive in a community. You'll get a whole group will say, well, they all deserve that. You should examine the causes of what made people do that. And then you'll get the other side who will say, we need law and order. It should all be stamped out, or the looters especially should be stamped out. And prejudice is a very difficult thing to either deal with or legislate for. And so the reconciliation of all of this is both troublesome and difficult to see how you move to another position. Or it's got to be something that is done slowly. Now, I've been listening on UK television for some of our Afro-American politicians. On one side, both Afro-Americans, one side saying, we have had great advancements in the United Kingdom. Think of this, this, this. And then we have the Labour members of Parliament saying, you just don't understand. This is this, this, this. And you listen to it and you just say, where can you reconcile this? Is this somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose? How do you unify this? And my fascination is not trying to proffer solutions to this. That really is above my pay grade now. But to watch, to see how both sides react, to see if there is a path through this. And clearly one of the paths is the ballot box too. So at the moment, the politicians are throwing fuel on this fire, because you have the Democratic Party who's sympathizing totally with one side of the argument, and then you have the law and order side with a different agenda, with a different voter base. So it's all ugly. And I don't have the solution to all of this. It's not an issue personally I've had a particular issue with. I get on with everybody.
And what are your thoughts on the whole idea of cancel culture, where you sanitize and remove parts of history, especially if they're visible, statues or, even names of streets, if they make people uncomfortable? How do you maneuver history? I know you're a history buff as well.
Well, the first thing on this is I don't agree with imposing today's standards on our forefathers who lived in a different generation. And it's quite clear for us today that we wouldn't behave the way we did. But that has been the evolution of society, that we have all changed. The Romans put people in an arena with lions for sport. We're not suddenly banning Italy for such cruelty that they did at that period of time. We evolved. And as far as the statues are concerned, I mean, the most provocative one in the UK is in Bristol of someone who contributed massively to the west of England, but was in the slave trade. And so we had a group of people who felt that this statue shouldn't be here. And my view on that is, if society in Bristol wants the statue removed, they have every right to do that. But I wouldn't destroy that statue. I would want to see that statue go to a museum with an explanation of where and how that statue and those days fitted into history. But I'm against erasing or spinning events that happen in the past. And again, it's a very divisive argument. Again, those will say, of course they're going to pull statues down. You don't understand the cause of the resentment. And then you'll get the Law and Order and other people who say history is important. So I think the museum one may be a compromise, but certainly some people will not even agree it should be in a museum.
True. Now, you also recently published and released your book, Unfair Game. Why is the treatment of animals such an important thing for you?
Well, this one is important to me. I first set foot in South Africa as a kid in 1948, when my father was going to his first posting in Africa. And I visited South Africa many, many times over the years. It's a beautiful country. It has a lot of problems, but a beautiful country. And the wildlife in South Africa has always been something that I've spent quite some time every year enjoying. And I heard a story that people were breeding captive lions for the purpose eventually for them to be slaughtered for their bones, stripped down, and exported to China for so-called aphrodisiac purposes. Or they were used to be slaughtered by hunters, these tame lions. But it wasn't a fair chase hunt. The lions were brought up in filthy conditions. The male lions were then advertised on the internet with a price list that you could pick your lion to go and hunt. And before you got there, in these farms in the remote areas of South Africa, they would sedate the lion to move it to a massive enclosure. Very, very big enclosures, a few kilometers wide and long. And in the morning, release it, and then the hunter would come. But you weren't chasing a wild lion, and you had a powerful rifle. And quite often the lion would walk towards you because it's got used to humans over the years. Then it's shot, and then these macho hunters sit behind the lion holding their rifle, overdosed with whatever. And I just felt that this majestic animal wasn't put on this earth. And there are about 12,000 captive bred lions against 3,000 or 4,000 in the wild in South Africa. And I was horrified when I heard this. So I first decided that I wanted to investigate it. And the first thing that I did is that I chartered a helicopter with a very, very strong camera with special forces guys to fly over half a dozen of these places to see for myself the conditions in which these lions were kept. And I satisfied myself that this was not good, and it was harming brand South Africa. And that's when I did a very serious undercover operation and actually infiltrated into the farms, and even took film of the cruelty and the slaughter of some of these animals. And then I've written the book about it, which is already causing quite some controversy.
Now, for most Belizeans, because of COVID, they actually sat down and saw Tiger King. How comparative would you say are the farms or captive areas in South Africa when you compare it to something like that? Because I think it would be a good frame of reference for people.
Well, the US one seemed more like a holiday camp for the lions compared to the brutality that they go through and the conditions in which they're kept in South Africa. The lionesses are forced to breed. The cubs are taken away from the lioness within the first few days so that tourists can pay to pet them, so they're dragged from their mothers. As they get slightly older, they have what they call walking with tourists. And so tourists come and they can walk with the lions. After that, for the females, they're then slaughtered. And then they're stripped for the bones to go to China. And the males are groomed to be shot in one of these canned hunts. So the whole life cycle is abuse of the beast of the jungle.
What are you hoping will come from your book and your presentations via different television shows, etc., with regards to your findings?
Well, I'm hoping, because within the bones I've had medical advice that these going to the Chinese market could be the start of another virus. So there's some medical reasons. And because there is no medicinal purposes for this, then I'm hoping that through governments and the World Health Organization, the pressure can be put on South Africa to ban the export of the bones. And that'll be one part of the equation. And then I'm hoping that other governments will put pressure, and that South Africans themselves, and what has surprised me is that how few South Africans actually know this is going on in their own country. Because these farms are very remote, serious perimeter fences, serious armed patrolling, and everything is kept quiet. And the only reason I really got to see these cages they're in was A, I went over by helicopter, and B, my team infiltrated the farms.
In terms of reform and in places like South Africa, do you think it's something that you'll see in your lifetime in terms of changes in policy?
Well, I mean, politics in general. I mean, South Africa is unfortunately, since one man, one vote, has been extremely corrupt. And so there's still a lot of suffering in South Africa. That again is another country that has all the resources to be a powerful economic country, but it's not happening. And but that's not my ball of wax to do anything else in South Africa. My focus is very narrow. It's just on this one trade that I think needs to be kaputted.
Now, let's move back to Belize, and you mentioned twice already about leadership, how important that is at a time when we have a global pandemic. One of the main criticisms that we've heard in Belize has been the lack of a comprehensive plan to say, for this phase, this is what we're going to do, this phase, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to move forward. How do you see the leadership in terms of being able to pull together a comprehensive plan that will remove some of the fear that people have, and at the same time solve some of the, or at least come up with some solutions for the challenges that we face?
Well, I don't think there's really much point in going back in time, because there's an old saying which you can adapt to this, is there's no record of success that cannot provide an opponent with material for criticism. And so it's better to say we are where we are. And I think the first important one is to be definitive as to when we're going to open the borders. The planning for that has to be the best protocols that we can put into place to minimize the effect, and to accept there may well be a tourist or two that does have an issue. But that's going to happen for the next year or two. So we have to have the ability to track and trace. We hope there can be a rapid test kit at some time, but it's doubtful whether it'll be ready before we need to open to see to the economic health of the nation. And that the Prime Minister's got this difficult call. And I suspect, I wouldn't be surprised if he's eyeing up around that August type of date, which is a bit of a compromise from between now and what he said at one time, no later than November the 1st. But I think there's been a recognition that leaving it to November the 1st is the economic health of the nation will start to rapidly deteriorate at a faster rate. There'll be more bankruptcies, there'll be more people that will never get back into business again, and all that's got to be taken into account. If we can get that, and then we have the issue, there's too many variables here to be definitive, is will the Americans, as our bigger market, want to start to travel internationally? So what would this next season be like? Will it be enough to even sustain the tourism industry? But we've got to start down that particular line. Will we have enough foreign currency? And if we don't, what can we do to improve that situation? And then we have the confusion of a general election in the middle of all of this. And when I was on Open Your Eyes a few weeks ago, I said my personal preference was for an early election, so that whichever party won, whoever became Prime Minister, knew that he didn't have to take political considerations into the decisions being made through a national crisis. And we've also had recently that the PUP have moved away from the Oversight Committee. But that shouldn't be taken as negative against the PUP. In any society, when there is an emergency, it is always incumbent upon the opposition to get in line with the government. And then always it drifts away, always. Because then what happens is a government doesn't want to abide by any decision of an oversight committee. It then says, well, it's really the Cabinet's decision. So then you have the opposition saying, well, hold on a second, you want us to have this combined entity, but now you're telling me the Cabinet's going to make the decisions. And then the opposition start to disagree with the progress. And if they say something, they're either being disloyal to this combined group, and if they're not careful, they get caught with approving the decisions which politically they don't want to make. So it's fairly natural that an opposition then moves away. But it's also incumbent upon the opposition with an election coming up to start to spell out, what are you going to do? And to be asked, if necessary, in that tone of voice. What are you going to do about crime in this nation? I hear you. You're saying we're going to tackle it. How? You say you're going to deal with corruption. How are you going to deal with it? You say you're going to put more resource into the productive sector. Well, how are you going to do it? And then whoever is the leader of the UDP have got to be challenged. Both parties challenged. How? Now, on corruption, a simple idea. You pass an act called a Whistleblower Act. And you say anybody that comes forward with information that leads to the arrest and conviction and the recovery of assets on a corruption charge, the whistleblower gets 10%. All right? That doesn't cost the government anything, because they would never have got anything. Now they've got 90% of what they've recovered, and they've only given 10% to the whistleblower. So if a party is serious about corruption, they've got to start to be serious.
Now, you spoke a little bit earlier, and I want to go back to this. You talked about the injection of foreign currency, and we've seen the Prime Minister talk about two different ways. The Treasury notes as one. Let's start there. What are your thoughts on that call for and the issuance of Treasury notes?
Well, I believe it is absolutely the right thing to do, because those Treasury notes are converted into Belize dollars. So you're killing two birds with one stone. You're actually giving the government 60 million Belize dollars for whatever programs it needs to do, whilst at the same time you're adding to your foreign currency reserves. Now, this current Treasury note, it appeared at first to be successful. The opposition started to criticize it. So there were some overseas investors that contacted me who were considering investing in this note, who now got a little freaked out that they were hearing stories about it wasn't lawful, that it should go to the House, so on and so forth, and went, whoa, we know that Belize has got trouble with the super bond, and now we're seeing that internally that the political arena is not certain. So I would suspect at the moment that they'll get up to 20 million, somewhere around that. But I also believe they could have got to the 30, and they may still do. But if there is a doubt about it, I would say to the Prime Minister, just take it to the House and push it through in one day and clear all so-called obstacles and give the overseas investors certainty on this particular note. Now, I have heard people say, well, why on earth would people take 6.5% when with the price of the super bond they can get 14 or 17%? Well, the answer is very simple. Investors don't expect the Treasury note to default, because Belize has never defaulted on a Treasury note, but they do expect the super bond to default. So therefore, you'll be lucky to get that yield at the end of the day. It's a different instrument, shouldn't be compared. And then I've heard the argument is, well, Jamaica is getting money from the IMF at this discretionary rate with no strings attached. Belize isn't. Well, I called a friend of mine in the UK Treasury yesterday or the day before to put this question to him. He said, no. He said, the IMF always impose conditions, but they're not necessarily legally binding conditions. They're saying to the nations, well, if we disperse this to you, we would expect you in the future to be doing this, and this. So I would suspect behind all of this with Belize that the IMF have been trying to impose in this sort of non-binding type letter restrictions, retrenchments, and then Prime Minister Barrow has got to say, do I want to bind my successor, if it's with a general election coming up, if it is the PUP? So therefore that's another reason that the Treasury notes are like a little hedge or a little insurance, that you must grab what you can when you can.
And the decision to approach the super bond and ask for, a delay, so to speak?
Well, for me, it's merely kicking the can down the road, because remember that interest is added to the capital to be repaid in 2034, and we're then paying interest on the interest that we're asking them to forego. But I don't suspect that that will be an easy path because the bondholders have to put it to a vote of the bondholders, and so they will want something more than just agreeing to be nice guys and to do that. But I think for me, I would just default on the bond.
What does that do to our credit rating?
Well, it can't be any worse than it is at the moment.
True. And on that note, we're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the economy of Belize and what options we have available to us. Don't go anywhere. Uncovering COVID-19 continues after these messages.
So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice, 100% Belizean, 100% pure and natural. Yeah, for the young and the old, for the rich and the poor, we drinking Caribbean pride. Yeah, for the hot and the cold, so me want a little more, and me not tell no lie. So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice. Well, alright, tell them we drinking Caribbean pride. Orange juice, or get the grapefruit, sweet and unsweet, and you can choose. Get the apple, the pineapple, the fruit punch, just pop the bottle. Yeah, quality in every sip. Me tell you how me taste the pride in every drip. Yeah, Caribbean pride #1. Tell them we drinking Caribbean pride.
In these challenging times, the one thing that is certain is that the Belize Bank Limited is here for you. There is nothing more important than your health and safety, and we continue to make every effort to make banking safer for you. Our staff is working around the clock to make sure you can do your banking conveniently 24/7 using our mobile banking app and online banking and keeping ATMs up and running. We value your relationship with us and are here to provide the support you need. First responders are also out there 24/7. Thank you, healthcare workers, security forces, firefighters, caregivers. You are all appreciated. Stay safe. We will get through this together. The Belize Bank, our country, your bank.
Save. The credit union way.
Member owners are encouraged to save regularly, borrow wisely, and repay promptly.
No use keeping the money in your pocket. Soon as you turn wrong, you know you ain't got it. So as money goes from hand to hand, give your cash to the umbrella man. I telling you, save. The credit union way. Save. It will make you rich someday.
Welcome back to Uncovering COVID-19 at Channel 5 Special. I'm still here with our special guest, Lord Michael Ashcroft. And before the break, you spoke about Belize's credit rating and where it is. For a lot of people, this entire pandemic has been very, dire in terms of the forecast. Can a small country like Belize rebound, and what would it take?
Well, all nations go through cycles. It's not that it won't rebound, it's the time scale to which it will and how long the hardship will go on for. And that again is this delicate balance between the residual health risk and the economic health of the nation. And the more you keep your borders shut, the longer you keep them shut, then that recovery becomes slower and more difficult as bad debts, the banking system has to start taking bad debts and provisions, and the thing gets in a mess. So yes, it can rebound. Problem with some nations, and Belize is one of them, that it goes into a pandemic already with high debt. Nations that would do well would be those that went into a pandemic without high debt. so that they can build up their debt level sustainably to go forward. And that's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of defaulting on the bonds, to effectively say, okay, bondholders, this is a rough time. You're just going to have to sit and wait in the line. We're not going to accommodate you. So therefore, for all intents and purposes, during the rebound, you haven't got any payments to be made. And therefore, the debt that you are then having to incur to look after the vulnerable, the poor, so on and so forth, is a greater pot to be able to do so.
Now, one of the other things that we've been talking about, talking in Belize in general, has been, for a long time we've been talking about this excess liquidity in the financial sector. I work in terms of agriculture, and I know that there has often been a mismatch between loans for the agro-productive sector in terms of the cycle itself. Are we still fairly liquid in terms of where we are in the financial sector, and how do we put some support behind the agro-productive sector, especially when we're looking at things like food security in the Belizean context, where it's very important right now, given the fact that we just had the floods as well?
Well, some of it is, yes, in aggregate, from central bank statistics, there is liquidity in the whole of the system. However, as the banks start to lend, let's say, into the agricultural sector, they have to consider what the collateral is and the value, because they are lending depositors' money. So they can't have a position where depositors feel that the bank is being risky with their money. It's a bit like government is spending your money type of thing in taxes and so on and so forth. And then you have the regulator who says, the moment that that farmer doesn't pay his interest, you've got to classify it as non-performing, you've got to start making provisions against it, and then all of a sudden you're eroding the capital of the bank, and then the regulator says, we now need more share capital. So you've got the central bank not wanting the banks to go belly up, quite naturally, but the banks can't afford to do anything which is risking their depositors' money or risking their shareholders' money without something from the government in all of this. And so countries have a different way sometimes of dealing with it. And it's the same with some of the small businesses. A small business that says we can't raise capital. But often the bottom line is that that young entrepreneur wants the bank to virtually lend 100% without much security. And if it goes wrong, the bank takes 100% of the risk. So you get a situation where the entrepreneur will get the upside if it goes well, but if it doesn't, the bank has to write off its depositors' money. It's a difficult equation to actually get right. Now, if the government at any time said, we need lower rates of interest for a particular sector and we will make up the difference, or we'll guarantee 20% of the debt, that's government policy if they want to do something like that. But there's not a perfect equation. And if government then starts to mandate things, then the banks will be very reluctant, and they will do anything they can to protect the integrity of their depositors' money. So they're tough equations, but government has to sit down and adopt their policy first. And I've heard that we should expand the agricultural sector. So when I was down in Toledo and Stang Creek, I went to have a look at agricultural land. I went into there. And the price of land in Belize is expensive in compared to our neighboring countries of Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, so on and so forth. So there's a higher cost. We don't have cheap energy cost. We don't have cheap labor. And for labor on agriculture, we would have to depend on being able to bring in labor from our neighboring countries.
Which we do for citrus and sugar.
Yeah. So you're very dependent on that. And of course, when there's a pandemic, you can't get your labor. And equally, you need large swathes of land if you're going to be able to compete, if you're looking for agricultural exports. And so it would need all the stakeholders to get together. It's all very well to say we're going to have a focus on agricultural production. But it's like I said at the earlier part, Will, you have to say to the politicians, how are you going to do this?
Following in that same vein, because we've been talking about diversification in agriculture, we've been talking about diversification of the economy, especially after 40–50% with tourism, and we've seen how devastating that has been. How do we and can we potentially really diversify our economy to be able to withstand another seismic shock like this pandemic?
Well, my first observation is we don't start this now. We can lay some plans for other activities except tourism. But the industry which is going to get us out of this is tourism. And I would be devoting more resources to develop tourism in the short term, because that's going to be your driver for your foreign exchange, so on and so forth. So I would encourage investment, but I'd also make it easier to get your foreign currency investors into that sector by certainly tidying up the land registry department here. I mean, you can take months to get something out of land registry, or if a foreigner wants to buy something in a title, the sellers like this, how long is the land registry going to do? There needs to be a system in which the first level is honesty of the people in the transaction, accept what it is, pay the stamp duty, get it out quickly, not have an appraisal system of people in a department saying, oh, well, I wonder if that's fair value, let's say it should be $50,000 more, and then going back to the buyer to say, well, there's some extra stamp duty because of this. You've got to, if you want to encourage that foreign investment into this country, you've got to make it easy to do. And you've also got to make it easy at central bank that if a foreign investor wants to register his inward investment, it's a simple process. So those things need to be there, because other countries make the purchase and investments in apartments in their tourist sector much easier, with sometimes more perks like either residency or citizenship. And we have to compete with the rest of the world. The foreign currency investor, the world is his oyster. He doesn't have to come to Belize.
Now, as we're talking about the economy, very often one of the things that brings the fear of God into people is the D word, devaluation. Can we maintain or peg in this kind of an environment?
Yes, we can.
And what will it take?
Well, it would take the ability to be able to get this foreign currency investment, to raise our US dollars. And that's why I'm for these treasury notes and any other mechanism in which to get foreign currency in. And you've got two political parties who both do not want to enter the realm of devaluation. Because once that starts to slip, or the Belize dollar floats, that's then a slippery slope. So I still want to see the dollarization of this economy. I mean, a couple of things which at one time brought the foreign investors in. One was the fact that our Supreme Court was the Privy Council in London, because people knew however a government stacked the judges at both the lower levels of the Appeal Court and the Supreme Court, that eventually get to the Privy Council, it was a fair shake. But we abolished the Privy Council, and I think that was a backward move. And the second one was of course English, or predominantly English. But the third one was the peg, that if they invested in something in Belize, that it held its value in that freely convertible currency at that particular rate. So I think it's worth fighting for. I don't think devaluation is inevitable. I would be rather reluctant for us to get into an IMF program too easily if the IMF started to impose that as one of the conditions.
Now, let's move a little bit away from the economy and talk about some of the other important factors, because we have a definitive date for return to schools, somewhere around August 10th. Obviously, the education sector takes up about 25% of the budget. We don't have that money, and you're talking about retrofitting schools to be COVID proof, so to speak. We still have challenges with access for internet across the country. How do you see the education sector? I just want your thoughts on the education sector and how can we move in that direction to make sure that we don't have this system continuing where children and young people may be out of school for half the year, and then you say, oh, we'll just promote them to the next level.
Well, you've got that ironical situation at the moment. You know, when I talked about 100% of us suffering for the 0.5% that so on and so forth, here you have another example where all the children are suffering for the adults, but yet COVID is hardly affecting young kids. So in the UK, I was in favour of getting the kids back to school. In fact, I do have a school with 1,000 pupils in London called the Ashcroft Technology Academy. We've been open the whole time, where we've been taking kids of the essential workers right the way through this whole process, and we've managed to cope, and we're now encouraging more kids to come back into school. But at the moment, it's voluntary if the parents want them to come back, but we're prepared to accommodate it. So I would encourage going back to school as soon as possible. I don't like the idea of artificial grading and so on and so forth. But where the resistance in the UK is from the unions. And so the unions, in a way, are saying it's not safe for our teachers, so on and so forth. And so again, you've got this playoff between these, those that want the kids back, those that feel it's still too risky. And again, it's a very difficult decision here for the Prime Minister to have to make, and he has to balance those risks too.
Now, the other thing that I want to talk about in terms of education is I want to focus a little bit on the agro-productive sector, because you talked a little bit about that and some of the challenges that exist there. We've seen new technology where they're talking about things like blockchain and trying to do, get people again online in terms of using information management, information systems to do the harvest and do so many other things. How can we, as such a small country, do the revolution that is necessary to shore up different sectors that we need to function as a whole?
Well, in any particular sector for a small country, is they should go out at whatever price and buy the talent to come and work the program out for the country. One of the most difficult things in any small country when they're moving into these new and very technical areas is actually having the domestic expertise to be able to do it. And so go out and find somebody who knows this sector back to front, pay him a fortune, because if he's then successful in introducing into the nation all those ideas that we've talked about, then the price you pay that man is not material. But you've got to take that jump of faith first. And I'm also in favor, in many areas in a small country, of coming to the acceptance that we don't have the talent to do this, or we don't have the talent to do that, but we must go and find the talent. And that's what I would do and recommend that we did in any sector that we wanted to look at.
Now, before we go to perhaps our final break and then have a wrap up, when you're talking about a small, I've heard people discuss COVID as proof that globalization may not be the best way forward, right? Especially for small countries like Belize, because you're just at the mercy of so many other factors. How do you get a country, just your thoughts, like Belize, that sometimes operates local instead of global, but we're pretty much exposed to a lot of global challenges? How do you get that shift in terms of your labor, your economy, your various sectors to actually operate local, yes, but global still?
Well, it's very difficult in the smaller nations because their pool of workers is also very small. And again, in smaller countries, it'll then depend how many of their citizens gets higher education in more technical and all these other particular areas. And it even comes to the politicians in the Westminster system is we don't always have the best of talent as our ministers that we have in Belize. We have to have our cabinet only of our elected people that are prepared to go into politics. So even in some of our ministries, I would be sympathetic in some of them, for the CEOs initially to be brought in to run the various ministries. And I know that will upset a lot of people. And what happens is that is then not politically acceptable because there's a pride that it should be the local people that run everything. And so these are very difficult political decisions to work your way through, because politicians always have the next election and where are our votes going to come from and how. So you have a conflict between an economic plan of a nation, and sometimes a benign dictator for a few years is not a bad thing. But the problem is once you have a benign dictator, it's difficult to get rid of them after that. But they're at least able to make the decisions that are in the long-term interests of the country and not in the short-term interests of the next election.
On that note, we're going to go ahead and take our final break, and when we come back, we'll have our final thoughts. Don't go anywhere. Uncovering COVID-19 continues and wraps up after these messages.
Save the credit union way.
Member owners are encouraged to save regularly, borrow wisely, and repay promptly.
No use keeping the money in your pocket. Soon as you turn wrong, you know you ain't got it. So as money goes from hand to hand, give your cash to the umbrella man. I'm telling you, save, save, save. The credit union way. Save, save, save. It will make you rich someday.
In these challenging times, the one thing that is certain is that the Belize Bank Limited is here for you. There is nothing more important than your health and safety, and we continue to make every effort to make banking safer for you. Our staff is working around the clock to make sure you can do your banking conveniently 24/7 using our mobile banking app and online banking and keeping ATMs up and running. We value your relationship with us and are here to provide the support you need. First responders are also out there 24/7. Thank you, healthcare workers, security forces, firefighters, caregivers. You are all appreciated. Stay safe. We will get through this together. The Belize Bank, our country, your bank.
So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice, 100% Belizean, 100% pure and natural. Yeah, for the young and the old, for the rich and the poor, we drinking Caribbean pride. Yeah, for the hot and the cold, so me want a little more, and me not tell no lie. So nice, Caribbean pride. Need you in my life, Caribbean pride. So nice. Well, alright, tell them we drinking Caribbean pride. Orange juice, or get the grapefruit. Sweet and unsweet and you can choose. Get the apple, the pineapple, the fruit punch, just pop the bottle. Yeah, quality in every sip. Me tell you how me taste the pride in every drip. Yeah, Caribbean pride #1. Tell them we drinking Caribbean pride.
Welcome back to Uncovering COVID-19 at Channel 5 Special. We're getting ready to wrap our show, and of course, I have one final question that I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in. I know in the past you've been very open about campaign financing, support for both major parties. With an election looming, is that something that will continue? And I also we've been trying for a long time to establish a third party in Belize. Your thoughts on a third party, and would you finance them?
I noticed the hesitation in your voice, Will, as you raised this particular subject. There are still many variables as to what both the main parties are going to stand for. As far as the UDP is concerned, I understand there could be 5 people thinking about they could be the leader of the UDP. Those are five very different people, and I would want to listen to their manifestos as to how, if they became leader, if they became prime minister, as to where they would take the nation. And then you have the PUP. And I'm waiting to hear, I did some polling pre-COVID. And so, and plus being able to travel around the place. But in that pre-polling, the majority of people in the country said that we're going in the wrong direction. And the 2 main issues were crime and corruption. So clearly we want to see who can address those. I also have an interest in the judicial system. I would like to see the judicial system in this country very professionalized and more independent from government whim. So it will really depend on who will be the party, not because of historical tribal relationships. I once joked that the colors are red and blue because they're the colors of the Blood and Crips of Los Angeles. It's what are they going to do if elected over the next 5 years, not just generalities. We're going to deal with crime, we're going to deal with corruption, we're going to deal with this, we're going to deal with that. It's how. And so and I'm a voter in the Fort George constituency, so I'm hoping that the two representatives will come and have a
conversation.
We'll have a conversation as to which way I cast my vote when it comes. Or it may be that it doesn't matter and there's no point in spending anything.
And the third party? What are your thoughts on
Third parties always have great difficulties getting together, especially where there's a group that really are fairly independent of each other. But they can get to a position, it's possible, that they can have the balance of power. But you've seen in Belize where anybody other than UDP and PUP have tried to put their name forward. It's very limited success. But if someone really, as a third party, wanted to have a go, they've got to really start much earlier in the cycle and not just when election is called. If I were to ask people at the moment, who's making up this third party, who are they? It's still pretty vague, and there's still this brand loyalty to red and blue. So it'll be interesting. And the timing of the election, whether it's November, whether the Prime Minister takes advantage of the extra 3 months that the Constitution gives him. Does he actually want to get through to as late as February? Or would he be tempted to go a month or two earlier? And that, of course, is just in the hands of the Prime Minister. So we have a lot going on. But the next 5 years is crucial to this country.
Your final thoughts on how do we ease ourselves other than people clamoring for the opening of the airport out of COVID and back into some normalcy?
How do we
take policy or figure out a way out to ease our way out of COVID? Because I think for a lot of people the conversation has been more around opening the airport, which doesn't guarantee that, as you said, tourists will come. In terms of the economic health of the country, how do we ease ourselves?
Well, I think you've got to divide the borders. When we talk about the airport, we're not necessarily talking about the land borders. So I think it's two different areas. Whilst Mexico and Guatemala have rising COVID, there may be a different view as to whether those borders open. And then when you get to the airport, those are fundamentally tourists, even though technically a Mexican could fly to Miami and come down. You'll never have a foolproof system. But at some point of time, that airport must open. There will still be residual risk unless you take the view that you're just going to isolate your country and bankrupt it. And there will be some people who will say, that's fine. We'll then pick up the pieces afterwards. But I would suspect the majority of people, those that have lost their jobs, those young entrepreneurs, those that have been trying to open businesses, that have risked all their life savings. And I heard one person say, well, let's not worry about the tourist sector because it's only those rich guys. And I said, well, what about all the people that they've laid off? It's not just the guys that own it, it's the consequences to their employees. And I went round all the lodges in the Keys and just skeleton staff, asking them how many they employed when they were running and how many they're employing now. I said, and what are all these people doing? They're staying at home, there's nothing for them to do. There's a limit to which you can push people. And so I wish the Prime Minister well in making a crucial decision. But what I think is important is I hope that the opposition will agree with the timings and the protocols and take it out of the political arena. It's too important not to.
And what's next for you?
Well, I'm semi-retired already. I've had a good life. I've done many things. So I shall write more books. I have causes that mean a lot to me. I hope that whoever the Prime Minister is, that we can find a way to doing more here. We'll see how the port project unfolds. We'll see, and we'll see how it goes. But I'm very flexible, and whatever happens, I'm still going to have a smile on my face.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest on this show. Thanks for sharing your opinions and definitely sharing some of your life lessons. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
We're going to wrap until next week. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I think next week might be our very last show. I'm not sure. I'm just calling that. I have spoken to the producer. But I know everything surrounding COVID is winding down. But we do need to start having other conversations on how we move forward as a country. Until next time, I'm William Neal. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Uncovering COVID-19 Pandemic, a Channel 5 special, was brought to you by the Belize Bank Limited, Holy Redeemer Credit Union, and Citrus Products of Belize Limited.